at UCSD. This is the second meeting of our roundtable for 2023. We have a really interesting discussion planned for today, but before I introduce today's speaker, let me remind you about the other events we have planned for this year. Big question everybody's asking, whether you're talking about housing or markets or the economy, is what is the Federal Reserve going to do next? And our summer speaker is one of the people on the Federal Reserve who will be making that decision. Loretta Mester is president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and as a member of the Federal Open Market Committee, she's one of the people that makes the decision. Is the Fed going to raise rates further and how much? She's been recognized as one of the hawks on the committee, raising rates, and she's going to tell us whether she thinks more is needed this summer. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't persuade her to come in person, so that'll be an online event, which we got used to during COVID, but that will be July 10th at 8 a.m. online, Loretta Mester. And we'll be back here in person in the fall, 7:30 a.m. October 6th. Every macroeconomics student has heard about the Taylor rule for monetary policy. Professor John Taylor from Stanford is one of the nation's most prominent macroeconomists, and I'm so happy that we persuaded John to come here in person. That'll be October 6th at 7:30 right here in the faculty club, so we're looking forward to that event. If you have any ideas for speakers or events, topics you'd like to see for next year, 2024, or feedback on any of the logistics of how the operation is going, please talk to one of the members of the steering committee who helps plan our events. Those would be Isaac Martin, Manny Labrinos, Melissa McGrain, Joe Marshall, Terry Moore, Alan Nevin, Alex Rojas, Don Billings, and Jeff Lewin. And let me also take this opportunity to thank the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, which co-sponsors these events with the Economics Department. I also want to thank our corporate sponsor, the CFA Society, and our other sponsors, Terry Moore, Sullivan Hill, and Alex Rojas from Short Point Realty. And now for today's event. We've been talking for years about how the world has changed with the emergence of China. Maybe you saw that India just surpassed China as the world's most populous nation. And whether you're paying attention or not, India is going to play a key role in world prosperity, in geopolitical stability, environmental protection, all the issues for the 21st century. And I'm so happy that UCSD now has a center to bring together teaching, research, policy analysis on India. The UCSD's 21st Century India Center brings insights from academic research into practical policy questions, the key challenges and opportunities for the world's most populous country. UCSD Professor Karthik Muralidharan is one of the world's leading experts on the Indian economy and is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at UC San Diego. He was born and raised in India, received his PhD in economics from Harvard. He's a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's a fellow and board member of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis and Development, a board member and co-chair of the education program at the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and an affiliate of several global research organizations. He knows I could go on and on, but I'm not going to because we're all very interested to hear what he has to say. Please join me in welcoming Karthik Muralidharan.
Thank you, Jim. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I don't think we could have timed this better. I think I agreed to do this maybe 9 months ago, and India just overtook China on the population clock in the last couple of weeks. So the timing couldn't be better. So I have about 35 to 40 minutes. And so just given, I could easily talk for 5 hours, as people who've heard some of my podcasts would know. So the hardest thing for this talk was, how do I kind of compress what I want to say in about 35 minutes for an audience that, is interested, but perhaps is not kind of, in the weeds of what's going on in India. So this guy seems to freeze. Okay, there we go. So I just want to kind of basically cover 4 main points. One is reiterate some of the points Jim raised and expand on them as to just why India matters, right? So sitting here in San Diego, in the US, why should you care about what's going on literally halfway around the world? I'm just going to do a very rapid taking stock of India at 75 in terms of what are, the great successes, but also the glass half full and the challenges that remain. And then the kind of conceptual core of the talk is I want to just go through 4 or 5 key themes in understanding India. So when you try to make sense of this complex place, what are some of the things you want to keep in mind? And then I'm going to end talking about challenges and opportunities and connecting that to some of my own research as well as work that's happening right here in the park. So I think why India matters is, we've already heard this, it is more than a sixth of humanity, close to 18%. And just for perspective, right, this is more people than all of Africa. That's 54 countries. It's more people than the entire Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America. That entire Western Hemisphere put together is about 1 billion, and you've got 1.4 billion. It's about twice the size of Europe. So it's just massive, right? It's the 3rd largest economy in the world in PPP terms. It's the fastest growing large economy. So even if you're sitting here just doing asset allocation for your global portfolios, India is going to matter. But it still has the largest absolute number of people in poverty. So it's kind of one of the themes you'll see again and again about India is everything that's true, the opposite is also true. Okay, and so that's kind of something to keep in mind when you try to hold these contradictions, because you can hear so many different narratives in India. And partly it's because when you've got 1.4 billion people, you can cherry pick from different parts of the distribution and tell any story based on whatever story you're trying to tell. So you can find a data point in India to fit any story you want to tell. Okay, and I think that's partly what makes it so difficult. If you're just kind of, in cocktail conversations and hearing about India, you can hear things across the spectrum. It is the largest democracy in the world. And I'll come back and talk a little bit about what this means in practice. It's not just a slogan. It's also one of the most diverse countries in the world. So there is literally no other country on this planet that has that kind of diversity within one set of national borders. It's increasingly integrated in global supply chains. And so again, even if you never set foot in India, you will probably consume goods that are partly made in India or partly, you'll work for a company and it's partly selling in India. Okay, so, but more importantly, the same thing applies to global public goods, not just private goods of consumption and production, but whether we're talking about global security, navigation, whether we're talking about disease control, supplying vaccines to the world, or most importantly, climate change, you're not going to solve these problems for the world without deeply engaging with India. So my bottom line is that India therefore matters both intrinsically in its own right. So even if if you care about improving human welfare, you can't do that without kind of doing that for India, just giving the sheer scale. But even if you don't care about India intrinsically, instrumentally, India is going to matter for the quality of your lives in the years ahead. So just some quick pictures. Top 10 countries in the world by GDP using purchasing power parity exchange rates. India is the 3rd largest in the world already. In market exchange rates, it's the 5th, but it's kind of slowly creeping up. I think it went from about 7th a few years ago, and that will just keep going up. Okay, but at the same time, in per capita terms, it's a lot less impressive. So the market exchange rates, GDP per capita for India is going to be less than, it's about 1/20th of what it is in the US. Okay, so you've got literally GDP per capita and market exchange rates of about 5% of the US, and at PPP, it's probably a little around 10 to 12%. Okay, so there's still an enormous amount of absolute poverty. But the flip side of that is, as we know from basic macroeconomics in our solar model, that with poor countries have the potential to grow much faster. Okay, and that's kind of what you're seeing in the data, where India is the fastest growing large economy in the world. And the IMF projects that about 50% of global growth in the coming years is going to come from India and China. So which means if you're investing capital and looking at where your returns are going to be, India is going to have to be part of your portfolio. So that's it, okay, in terms of why India matters. Now, taking stock of India at 75, I'm just literally going to do 2 slides, right? So the positives, the good news is that, the political project that is modern India has been an astounding success. Okay? So there's this old famous quote from an economic historian, Abba Lerner, that says, any economic problem is a solved political problem. Right. So before you can start thinking about economics and development and growth, you first need what's called the political settlement, right? I mean that people in these borders kind of agree that they're going to live together and be a harmonious kind of entity. So at the time of independence, many foreign experts thought India was not going to survive, right? There is more diversity across India than in any other country on earth. We've just been through kind of the horrors of partition, where you had neighboring states of West and East Punjab, West and East Bangladesh, essentially Bengal, essentially partitioned with kind of massive migrations. We've got Professor Bhardwaj here who's done some work on that, among the largest kind of migrations of the 20th century. So given all of these challenges, it's a minor miracle. It's a miracle that the center has held and that the country is a solid political harmonious entity. There is enormous diversity, which I just talked about, across religion, region, language, caste. And on top of all of this, you've also got the building and sustenance of democracy. And in many ways, I would argue that the democracy is almost essential to keeping India together, because part of the key thing that a democracy does is it creates process-based legitimacy, so that even if you don't agree with the outcomes, that there's a legitimate process by which the policies are being taken. And that's in turn key for the political settlement of people being able to stay together. So there's similar success on the economic front, especially since the 1980s. Now, we did have a couple of lost decades in the 60s and 70s, and that reflects a long socialist legacy, which I'll talk about. But in the starting 80s, and especially from the 90s, when you had economic liberalization, you had rapid annual growth. So India is, I think, the fastest growing large democracy in the world, and it's the fastest growing democracy except for Botswana over the past 50 years. And Botswana, like India, has 500 times the population. Okay, so Botswana is like about 3 million. And so just to give you a sense of scale, this is not easy to pull off, right? I mean, at the kind of scale we're talking about. So these growth rates are impressive, and the poverty rate has fallen from about 70% at independence to about 20% in 2011. There's an extremely dynamic private sector, and tech-driven innovation is something that you're seeing in every part of the Indian economy. So the economy, there's many, many, many things to be proud of. And then finally, looking at the Indian state, right, which many people complain about, and so do I. But before we start complaining, we first have to acknowledge what's kind of good about it, right? And so the Indian state, in what we call mission mode, when it kind of applies its mind to do something, is incredibly impressive. So it conducts the world's largest elections. The complexity of running these elections, it runs the world's largest censuses, vaccination campaigns. So anything India does, well, now I was going to say even that China does, will be the largest in the world. It's got some of the best top-class disaster relief operations in the world. So I think you're just used to being able to get the machinery of the government moving when you have the natural disasters that happen at, unfortunately, large frequencies. So taken together, the combination of science, growth, and democracy makes India an increasingly important global player on several issues as well. So that's the good news. Now, what's the less good news? And this is going to sound very bleak. Okay, it's going to sound very bleak, but I'll come back and give you some perspective on why it's not as bad. Okay, as it seems. But the less good news is if you look at key measures of human development and key measures of population welfare, there is still a very long way to go. So if you look at education, we've managed to kind of push out school enrollment to get over 95% of kids in school. But the learning outcomes are abysmal. Okay, so about 50% of fifth grade students in rural India complete primary school without being able to read. Okay, without being able to read at a second grade level. So, and I'll come back and talk about kind of what how this doesn't compute with people who look at Indian CEOs in every part of kind of Fortune 500 companies and saying, we thought you guys had a fantastic education system, right? But basically what you'll see is that the core of the Indian education system and the core of the success of the Indian diaspora in the US, and you see these numbers, that it's by far the most successful demographic in the US, the highest average income, but that's basically a selection top 1% story, right? I mean, that you're picking the extreme top of that distribution. So Professor Devesh Kapoor they have this lovely book called The Other 1%. And it's essentially a story of Indian emigration in the US. So it's essentially about the Indian diaspora in the US. And they just document why, the Indian community in the US is so successful. It's because it is basically the top 1% of a billion-plus person distribution. Okay, and so that's kind of the selection that's driving what you're seeing in the US. Same with health and nutrition. Got the largest number of malnourished and stunted children in the world. Got over 60 million kids under 5, whose height at age 5 is 2 standard deviations below what the global mean should be. So that's the definition of stunting. And so So one of the problems with poverty, and I'll tell you a bit more, is that the poverty line itself is defined as the minimum amount of income you need to have the level of calories to kind of live a healthy life of 2,000 calories a day. That's it. So the question is, how do people below poverty even survive? And the way they survive is essentially the body simply doesn't grow enough, right? So the body reduces its metabolic needs. And so the manifestation of poverty in the long term ends up being kind of stunting, which means you stay alive, but then you're significantly reducing human potential if you haven't grown like in those early years, okay? Similarly, healthcare. We've got massive challenges in terms of providing quality healthcare for such a large population. And even though the top end of the Indian healthcare system, again, is perhaps the best in the world on a cost-adjusted basis, over 70% of primary healthcare is with the fee-charging private sector. And India has 13 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution. Okay, so these are serious, serious challenges. Police and public safety, right? The police are understaffed, undertrained, under-equipped, and overworked. And if you want to understand India, you should watch Bollywood movies, right? And so there's a reason why the police always reach kind of the crime scene in the last scene. Like, it reflects reality that they often aren't just anywhere to be found, okay? Like when you need them. And that leads to massive underreporting of crime. And then part of that, that also reflects a very kind of dysfunctional court and justice system, okay? So there is some fast track mediation and arbitration for kind of high level corporate investment. So it doesn't really affect kind of external investment as much, but the day-to-day functioning of the court system is just, it's a mess, okay? So essentially the way to think about India, and this is what I'm going to talk about, what I've been working the last 4 years and writing this entire book, is that you've got a very, very, very capable state in some ways when it puts its mind to stuff, but it's kind of just overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what it needs to manage, right? So it's not an incapable state, it's an overwhelmed state, right? It's kind of the way to think about, why you see all of this, okay? So given that, how do we understand it? How am I doing that? Okay, not bad, so 20 minutes, right? So, so key themes in understanding India. So these are just the facts, right? Now, how are you going to make sense of this? So one key theme that's just important is that there's still a deep socialist legacy, right? And this is a legacy that, it reflected India's first generation leaderships, very strong distrust of markets and trade because the entire colonial enterprise, right, had come with the East India Company coming to do trade. And that trade was really the sharp end of the spear, that ended up colonizing an entire country and civilization for over 200 years. So the scars of that colonial experience are just very, very deep in the psyche, right, of Indian elites at the time of independence. And even now, those who are kind of, the pro-market, pro-trade factions of Indian policy are always kind of, pushing a boulder uphill because this visceral distrust of kind of, of trade and foreign capital. But it's not just that, but also the fact that the dominant intellectual paradigm in the world post-World War II for development was really one of state-led development. So if you looked at which were the countries that had grown fast in the first half of the 20th century, the main model was the Soviet Union. And so central planning, 5-year plans, this was not just India, right? But it was also China, and a lot of kind of newly independent countries had that. Okay, so that legacy is still kind of very dyed in the wool in the Indian system. And you had a history of several suboptimal policies, which I won't get into, but if you want to read, I can give you books to read about there's this wonderful book called India Unbound that talks about how most of the problems were self-inflicted by laws that were trying to keep industry small. So you had this kind of sense that small is beautiful, right? So you had a lot of industries that were reserved for the small sector. Ironically, forgetting that the reason you reserve it is to allow them to grow, right? But by kind of requiring that you stay small, you get a whole bunch of government subsidies and credits, you kind of discourage the low-skilled scale manufacturing. And so these are things that still cast a long shadow on the Indian economy. Now, of course, this feels like in the long past, over 35 years ago, but what's important to know is that India's kind of transformation in the 90s after these economic reforms, and I teach all of this in my undergrad class in the Indian economy, these have unleashed growth, unleashed India's potential. But The reforms were still done by stealth in the sense that they were done by elite technocrats under external pressure because there was a balance of payment crisis and you had to mortgage your gold literally to meet those payments. And so it was because of the crisis that the technocratic leadership was able to say we need these reforms, but the popular democratic case for economic reforms has not yet been made, okay? And so this is something we need to understand, which is the governments in the last 30 years that are primarily associated with market reforms have not gotten reelected, okay? And so there's this great quote by the Prime Minister of Luxembourg about the nature of politics. He says, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get reelected after doing it. So what that means is that the political understanding of what it takes to win elections in India is that it is still fundamentally built around welfare programs and welfare schemes, because that's kind of what is visible that you can take credit for. Whereas the economic growth, and there's another reason why the political connection is not being made, right? So, and when I'll come back and talk about India and China, but basically, if you look at the key to growth for most countries, it's being low-skill manufacturing that you do at scale, right? So that was part of the Taiwan story, the South Korea story, the China story. And the reason you've historically needed manufacturing to grow is three things, right? You get economies of scale, as Adam Smith taught us. You get exportability, right? Which is key because then you get global markets. And you create a large number of low-skilled jobs, right? Which is what you get in manufacturing. Now, the Indian story, we have 2 out of the 3, okay? And the reason is it reflects partly both the education system that invested a lot more in tertiary education than primary. And it reflects the fact that there were all of these kind of barriers to scale, barriers to using kind of physical resources. And so industry pivoted to capital intensive industry. So India does really well in knowledge-based exports, right? Because you did the tertiary education and you didn't need large kind of firms. You could do that with smaller numbers of people. So where India got really lucky is in the late 90s, what the internet did was it made a lot of services, the non-tradable services became tradable services, right? And so a key part of the Indian growth miracle has been the export of knowledge intensive services. So whether it's software, whether it's pharmaceuticals, these are knowledge intensive sectors, right? And so you get 2 out of the 3 benefits that you get from manufacturing. You get the scale, you get the exports, but you didn't create the large number of jobs in kind of the in manufacturing that visibly pulls people out of poverty, right? So the story of the political economy of India has been that the growth is driven by a few sectors, and then the political class comes and creates a bunch of welfare programs to try and distribute the gains of that. But people don't directly participate in the growth process as much as you would if you had a lot more low-skilled, factory jobs, which you haven't had for some of these legacy reasons that I'm talking about. Okay, so this is a lot to cover, but hopefully that all makes sense, right? And so, so that's exactly what I just said. You've got the skewed distribution of India's growth, which is driven by the skill-intensive export. So one way to think about India is people say, oh, it's a huge country, it's a huge market, but it's really 3 completely different slices, right? There's about 10% of India that lives in what I call the dollar economy, right? Because you're working in sectors that are kind of globally tradable, globally competitive, and that's the engine that's driving the economy. Then you've got the next 30% who are kind of in the adjacencies, who are benefiting from the spillovers created by the demand from that top 10%, right? So for every software engineer job, you create a job for a security guard, for a cook, for a cleaner, and transport bus services. So there's all of those ancillary jobs that get created, and that's in that next 30 to 40%. And then there's the bottom 50% that's kind of pretty much left out of that process, okay? So that's kind of what's going on broadly. And then when you overlay politics on top of that, you can see why the median voter, like Kamheen, is still not directly participating in the growth process. And so therefore what matters politically, like Kamheen, is, am I able to deliver welfare programs, okay? So that's kind of, and that leads to my second slide, right? The second key theme. So in understanding India, what's critical to understand is that India is this enormous outlier in human history, right? It is the only country that had universal adult franchise democracy at such a low level of development. So I think, we had somebody who went to India who said, oh, the US is a 200-year democracy, and we're about 75 and we're figuring it out, 250. But the truth is that the US and the UK, what we consider classic old democracies, were very flawed democracies, right? Very limited democracies, because the vote is restricted to people who are educated and have capital. So the working class doesn't have a vote, women don't have a vote, right? And so the vote is basically restricted to like the top 20% of the demographic. And that is so fundamental for the politics of a country. And that's because the core question in public finance is, what am I doing with taxpayer money? Am I building public goods and infrastructure that gets you more growth, or am I doing more welfare? Okay, so there's tons of studies that show how the extent of democracy in a country is strongly correlated with the welfare state, right? And that's because if I have an income distribution, if you're left of the mean, you want more redistribution. If you're right of the mean, you want less taxes and less redistribution. So that's a basic economic incentive. So what we forget is that the development trajectory of the US, of most countries, followed what I call 3 phases of the state, where for the most of human history, the state was a security state. The only thing you did was defense and law and order. It was only in the 19th century, you get to the second phase of the state, which I call an industrial state, where the state, the government decides we're going to build massive infrastructure, roads, railroads, canals, transportation, sewage systems, public, and it's not a coincidence that that goes with the Industrial Revolution, because now you get economies of scale in production. But what you get with that growth is you also get a growth in inequality, because most of those gains are going to people with physical capital, financial capital, human capital, right? So you've got the land, you've got the finance, or you've got the skills, right? So those are the 3 classes of people who benefit from the growth. And then you get this growing inequality, but then as you expand the franchise, which is true in both the US and the UK, you then get kind of the democratic push for the modern welfare state, right? So that's kind of the arc of the evolution of most OECD countries. Now, what makes India unique is that you had universal adult franchise democracy on day 1, okay? And so what that means is that the Indian political class faces more pressure to do welfare and redistribution than any other political class at a similar stage of development. So, and this is the double-edged sword, right? So the democracy is a great moral triumph because it's giving a voice to the most marginalized people at a time when they didn't have a voice in richer countries. But the way I describe the paradox of Indian democracy is that it's given every citizen the ability to make a claim on the stage, but it hasn't given the state the incentives to be able to meet those claims. Okay, so, and that's why everything about India is always kind of this glass half full. And it's not that we're doing badly, it's just that the aspirations are so much ahead of the capacity to deliver, right? I mean, and this is something that permeates every discussion on India, right? And so that's what I said, it creates a set of pressures that we have no precedent for in history. And that's the trade-off between public goods and redistribution that tends to be skewed towards the latter. And it's much easier to win votes on redistribution than longer-term development, okay? And so again, the problem is not welfare spending per se, because we have a lot of research in development economics that says when people are really poor, providing the right kind of welfare can improve both equity and efficiency, right? Because when you've got people with what we call a nutrition-based poverty trap, you can, in the US, you think in public finance that it's almost axiomatic that there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. That if I want to do more redistribution, I'm reducing efficiency because I'm reducing the incentives of people to work through taxation, and I'm also reducing the incentives to work of the people who are poor by giving them these handouts, okay? But the key difference between development economics and public finance in the US is that all of development economics is about identifying reasons for why when people are extremely poor, you can come in with interventions that improve both equity and efficiency. So the problem is not welfare. The problem is trying to do the welfare without the administrative and fiscal capacity to administer a welfare state. Okay, so, and that's the real challenge. Okay, so I'll come back to talking about it. So bottom line is Indians are justifiably proud of their democracy, right? This is a signature achievement, but it just poses an enormous set of challenges that has no precedent anywhere else in human history. So there's an interesting contrast with China, right, on sources of legitimacy. So you go to China in the 90s or 2000s, it's kind of amazing how much more paranoid the local party official is about delivering growth, okay, compared to India. And my simple answer for this is that governments can have legitimacy. You can have either process-based legitimacy or performance-based legitimacy, right? So process-based legitimacy is you won an election. And so nobody questions why you're in power. And so even if your performance is awful, voters don't revolt because they'll say, we'll just vote you out, okay? But in China, over time, when you don't have process-based legitimacy, the only thing that keeps you in power is delivering growth, right? So if you don't deliver the growth, now you can suppress the revolutions with kind of surveillance, but in the 90s and 2000s, If you don't deliver the growth, you're dealing with unrest, right? So in a funny way, non-democratic Chinese leadership was more paranoid about delivering growth than democratic India. That's partly because there's a process that lets out the steam, right? Meaning of why your government is legitimate. So again, we can talk a lot more about that, but I can give an entire seminar in India versus China, but I thought that's kind of useful to put out there. So let me kind of get back to this point about weak state capacity, right? This is the governance machinery is quite weak at routine service delivery, and it reflects chronic underinvestment in the state. And so basically the way to think about this is the modern Indian state is built on a colonial legacy, right? It's built on the architecture of the colonial state. And the colonial state was only designed to do two things. It was designed for law and order and revenue collection, right? Because it was basically an extractive state that was trying to extract all the surplus from the land. And there's many, many books that talk about this. Now, the challenge for India is that democratic India has added several expectations on the state, but without adequate investment in the capacity of the state to deliver. So going back to what I said about public goods versus redistribution, one of the most basic public goods is the state itself, right? And that's why, the building state capacity becomes one of the most essential projects for India going forward. Okay, so yeah, so I've already said that. And then the last theme about India is a very strong private sector and civil society. So the weakness of the state is offset to some extent by an extremely active private sector and civil society. So in particular, India is a world leader in what we call frugal innovation, right? Which means so in the US, we put a premium on innovating at the cutting edge of quality, even if it's going to cost you a lot more. In India, the premium is on innovating on cost reduction, right? Because people are so poor and very, very price sensitive. So it's like, how do I get 80% of that quality at 10% of the cost? Okay, so that's the core of where innovative energies in India go to. And there's many, many, many success stories of kind of startups and kind of local entrepreneurs who manage to deliver outstanding quality at scale. It won't be like the cutting edge, but it'll be really good at a much, much, much lower cost. And so those models of innovation are often more relevant, as we think about other low and middle income countries. You see this in healthcare, you see this in a variety of consumer products. There's a very vibrant civil society. But the failure of public good provision, right, of law and order, environment, education, and health is still a big drag on India's potential. So, to sum up, India is home to striking contradictions. And this is, I think, attributed to Joan Robinson, but multiple people have said this, that everything that's true, the opposite is also true. So in education, you've got some of the most high achieving, people in the global diaspora of Indian origin, right? So CEOs of God knows how many companies, not to mention the chancellor of UCSD, right? All came from India and came through that schooling system. You see this in health, you see this in IT services, but the opposite is also true. Okay, so you've got the world's largest number of kids who can't read, the world's largest number of stunted and malnourished children, and IT services, Indian companies are providing IT solutions for literally every Fortune 500 company, but many government offices are still running on kind of paper, right? And so that's then again, because the government is not able to pay, right? For the public goods that they need to upgrade themselves, all right? Now, this also reflects high inequality, right? Any government, any society, in some ways reflects the society itself. And so this is a highly unequal and stratified society. So one way is just in the last year, if you look at the range of books in India, right? So the McKinsey global head comes and says, it's not just India's decade, it's India's century, okay? So you've got extreme rah-rah optimism on one side. And then you've got another book by a Princeton economist that's called India is Broken, okay? And just talking about all of the challenges, right? And so as with everything in India, the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? These can all be true at the same time. So one of the most important things about India is learning to hold contradictions in your head, and kind of what I'm trying to give you some sense of the underlying structure as to why, right? You have that kind of variation. So in the last 5 minutes, what I want to talk about is just where do we go from here, right? So there's many things that are going well, right? There's many things that can be done better. So I find this big picture very useful, which is one of the great debates in the global development context is that For a long time, the World Bank and the IMF would focus on GDP per capita as the measure of development of a country, right? And then along came Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in '98, and basically said, listen, we're measuring development all wrong, okay? It's not about income, it's really about human capabilities, right? So are people able to live a more meaningful life? And you measure that with with health, with education, and a bunch of these measures, okay? Now, the thing is, in the end, this distinction is a little kind of semantic, because every development outcome ends up being correlated with GDP per capita, right? So richer countries have higher life expectancy, have better education, have better everything, okay? So why does this debate matter? The reason the debate matters is the global development community has kind of been bipolar and polarized into one group that says, just focus on growth, right? You get growth going, everything else will follow. Everything else will take care of itself, okay? And then you've got the other view coming from Amartya Sen and others that says, listen, you don't need to wait to get rich to get developed. Okay, so, and the examples they talk about would be, say, Cuba and Vietnam and Kerala, and which is a state in India, to say these are societies that manage to deliver universal education, very low infant mortality, high life expectancy at very low levels of income. So you don't need to wait to get rich to get developed, right? And so this has been the biggest kind of tension in global development, right? Now, at some level, I think this is partly semantics because there's a virtuous cycle, right? You grow faster, you get more human development. You get more human development, you grow faster because each of these factors contribute into growth. And so basically, where my point of departure in this debate is, see, if you look at India, we're exactly where you would expect, okay? So that is India, right? So that's India right there. In fact, it's slightly better on most indicators, and that's kind of the line of message. So which is why, the people who say India is doing great are not right, or who say India completely sucks are not right. So India's grade is a solid B+, right? So as a professor who gives grades, I'll say you're B+, you can do better, okay? and so that's kind of where we're going. And so what is the goal? What do you want to do? He's saying at a given level of income, can you get better development outcomes? And so the one case for optimism here is historically, so this is this very famous curve by Samuel Preston, who's a demographer who wrote this paper in the 1970s, and Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015, did a lot to kind of popularize that work among economists. And the basic point is that if you look at this curve is life expectancy against national income, and this is what this looked like in 1930. But if you look at this in 1960, you see that the same countries at the same level of GDP per capita had much higher life expectancy. So you were able to push development outcomes up significantly over time, even at the same level of GDP per capita. Okay, and so what made this possible is essentially new medical technologies, right? So new medical technologies, vaccinations, recognizing that diarrhea is a leading cause of death and that it just takes really inexpensive oral rehydration supplements. This is not very expensive, okay? But most of this shifting of the Preston curve, and that continues. So this is 1960, and then you go to 2015, you see this continued upward shift, okay, at any given level of GDP per capita. Okay, and so this mainly reflects the fact that 100 years ago, you could be the king of England, but if you got a bacterial infection, nobody could help you, right? Today, you could be a daily wage laborer in India and have a bacterial infection, and there's low cost antibiotics available that can save you, okay? So the biggest driver of improvement in the human condition over time has been better technologies, and you see this particularly in health, right? Which is why folks like the Gates Foundation or WHO, they spend a lot more of their time on kind of technology adoption and diffusion and saying, how do you kind of help existing technologies get out to where it can have much larger impact? So one of the cases for optimism, and connecting this back to my own research, is can you similarly shift this Preston curve for governance more broadly across every sector, across education, across environment, across police, across every aspect of kind of modern life, okay? And so the question is, what do today's developing countries, including India, that today's OECD countries did not have at the same level of historic per capita income that can improve the quality of expenditure and quality of life? And what we have is we have much, much, much better data. We have better data, we have better evidence on what kind of policies work and what kind of policies don't, okay? And you have much better technology to empower people and to improve the quality of governance and public expenditure. So a lot of my own work in education over the past 20 years has just documented staggering variation in the cost effectiveness of different kinds of interventions. So you can do things that look good on paper, like increase salaries of all teachers across the board, but that has no impact on learning outcomes, okay? On the other hand, you can do very, very inexpensive things like providing kids with a deworming pill once in 6 months, right? And that little deworming pill ends up being way more effective than anything else you could do because the intestinal worms are contributing to lower nutrition, lower school attendance, lower absorption of materials. But because it falls between the cracks between the health ministry and an education ministry, right? Because the education ministry says my job is to build schools and hire teachers and get textbooks into the schools. The health ministry says my job is to run health centers. But the idea that you could do a little health intervention in the schools is something that falls between the cracks. So that's been an example of a very, very simple intervention that has been highly, highly effective. Okay, so, and you can see that in sector after sector, that many expensive things have no impact. Other much less expensive interventions have huge impact, but don't get scaled up because it falls through the cracks, right? So the role of the research and the evidence is to then kind of shed light on how much kind of $100 bills on the sidewalk we're leaving as a country, right? Like by saying, hey guys, this is where your money is, but this is where the returns are, right? So if I came to you as private capital and said, I'm going to give you a bunch of investment ideas that give you 10x, 20x ROI, you're going to say, how do I put as much money as possible? And we're routinely giving up those kind of opportunities. So the value of the research then is in that area. Now, why is the research and evidence so important in public spending? If you're in the private sector, I don't worry about how Toyota makes its cars or kind of people in the private sector do. Why? Because if you face competitive markets for both your inputs and your products, then if you're not productive, you go out of business. If you're not innovating, you go out of business, right? Whereas in the public sector, you can spend other people's money badly for a very long time. Okay, so when you're spending your own money badly, you go out of business quickly. When you're spending other people's money, you can do this badly for a really long time. Okay, and that's why the research and the evidence is so important, because it helps guide resource allocation of hundreds of billions of dollars, and the ROI on that is so high. Okay, so let me just end with one picture, right? So here's a simple picture from one of my papers. So this is, I consider it so simple, but I consider it one of the most important pictures to understand developing country education, or at least because this is true not just in India. So what is this picture showing you? It's basically based on a computer-aided learning intervention that we did, okay? And so what the CAL software is able to do is today, if you're in 8th grade, and I give you an 8th grade test, and if you score 0, I have no idea how far below 8th grade standards you are. Now, what the computer does is by dynamically shifting the difficulty of the question, I can pinpoint exactly what grade level you're at, okay? So what this picture is showing us is the x-axis is the grade you're enrolled in, and the y-axis is what is your assessed level of math ability by the software. Now, if you were making peace with the textbook and the syllabus, you should be on this 45-degree line, okay? But what you see is that the true level of learning is about half of that. So in 8th grade, your average kid has about a 4th grade level of competency. But even more important is not that. Even more important is how much variation there is in a classroom. Okay, so these are kids in an 8th grade classroom who are testing at a 2nd grade level, at a 3rd, at a 4th, at a 5th, at a 6th, at a 7th, and 8th. And that's because a policy that said we should not have dropouts and therefore we should have social promotion and promote kids to higher grades regardless of what standards they've met means that if you're an 8th grade teacher, you're sitting there with kids like across the range from 2nd to 8th grade range. And so then this helps make sense of why is improving facilities, why is spending more on teachers, why is that not having much of an impact? And ये इसलिए हो रहा है क्योंकि अगर अभी आपके बीच में मैं दूसरी भाषा में बात करने लगा तो आप समझिए मैं बड़ा क्वालिफाइड हूँ, बड़ा मोटिवेटेड हूँ, आके सुबह 7:30 बजे पढ़ाता हूँ, लेकिन आप सब बैठे हो कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहा है मैं क्या कर रहा हूँ। और ये देखो इतना होशियार बच्चा है, आप इसके लिए क्यों नहीं पढ़ते हो? आगे क्लास में बिना पढ़ के हद है। So what I've just done to you is give you like 45 seconds in the shoes of a kid in a typical Indian classroom. And I said, I could be the most qualified professor. I could be the most motivated professor. I could show up at 7:30 in the morning to teach you, give you twice the content that you would get in any other talk, but it's still like I'm talking a different language if I'm not pitching the material at your level. And so then the point of the research is it helps understand why is it that all of my spending is not translating into outcomes. And that's because we're not alleviating the binding constraint, which is that you're not targeting the teaching at the right level. And so this is the body of work that actually was recognized by a Nobel Prize to my advisors, right? Michael Kramer and Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo in 2019. And that's the value of the research in kind of driving improvements in public expenditure. And the scale of the impact is massive. So let me end by saying, the goal over time is to shift this precedent curve and kind of accelerate India's development by so essentially, if I go back to this picture, right, the traditional view is wait for growth, right? And then everything will take care of itself. The human development view is to say we can't afford to wait for growth. We need to spend more on the social sector. And my point of departure here is that this debate is fundamentally a zero-sum debate, right? Do I allocate my budget to CapEx or to human development? But what I'm saying is that that's distracting us from the much more important low-hanging fruit, which is the quality of your public expenditure so bad, regardless of whether you're spending on the social sector or on CapEx, that if you're so far inside your PPF, right, mean that focusing on the efficiency of public expenditure and the quality of public expenditure will allow you to do more of everything. And when you do more of everything, that allows you to deliver much better development outcomes at any given level of GDP per capita, because you're going to be using your resources much better. Okay, so that's kind of the optimistic note I want to conclude on, right? So, which is to say that, so all of this is kind of what I've been working on for the last 3.5 years. This is the book on building a better India. It will be out at the end of this year. It's kind of, being worked on, but it is 550 pages, but it goes through kind of both making sense of India, understanding the building blocks of the Indian state. So what I call the politician's predicament is what I give you a sense of, right? Which is voters have expectations beyond your capacity to deliver. And so what do you do? And so it's just getting you into the incentives and constraints of the key actors of the Indian state. And then we've got these themes about how to improve the effectiveness of the state, and then how do you apply those in these key sectors. And again, these are sectors: education and skills, health and nutrition, police and public safety, courts and justice, social protection, and jobs. That these are all both intrinsically important for human welfare and instrumentally important for kickstarting economic growth. So the hope is that by getting this piece right, you can kind of kickstart, right, both development and growth and take it to a higher trajectory, right, than where it is now. So yeah, let me stop there and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Karthik, for a very informative talk. And I hope helping everybody understand how proud we are at UCSD to have a scholar of your caliber. So we have a microphone, and I'll let you call on people. So starting with Don.
Thank you very much. Much of what you talked about actually would be equally applicable to the United States. I wonder if you'd be willing to run for president. The actual question, there's a lot of talk about deglobalization and the BRICS emerging as a bloc and so forth. I wonder if you can address that in terms of the prospects for the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, so two things, right? So one is, if you look, the academic evidence is very clear that more globalization is good for growth, right? So if you look at periods of convergence and divergence, so basic economic theory from the Solo model tells us that poor countries should grow faster, right? And the two big reasons for that is that the marginal returns to capital are higher when you're poor. And second, it should be easier to absorb new technologies when you are behind as opposed to innovate, right? But so the theory tells us we should see convergence. But if you look at the data, you see that there's periods when there's convergence and there's periods when there's divergence. Okay, so the period of 1870 to 1914 is a period of convergence. And then the 50 years after that, you don't see much convergence, particularly between 50 and 80. And then the period 1980 to 2016 is another period of convergence, right? And And so what that suggests is that this is highly correlated, right, with globalization, because those two mechanisms of convergence both one requires mobility of capital, right, and mobility of technologies. And so it's really in times of globalization, whether it was that 1870 era, or the 1980 era, that you've seen massive increases in both growth and kind of catch up of poor countries, right? So we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 40 years than at any time in human history. And that's basically driven by India and China. So what I do worry about, right? I mean, there are times I worry about the saying that, are we in a 1914-like moment, right? I mean, where we've ridden the wave of 45 years of globalization, but that then comes with multiple complications of both increased inequality, right? I mean, as well as, people left behind, right? I mean, and people left behind in the process, and there's a backlash created there. And then the other source of tension is you also have, and this is, I think, the fundamental tension, right? Which is the difference between the economic view and the strategic view of things. The economic view of trade is comparative advantage. And so more trade, more globalization is always good. The strategic view is that it's not just the absolute levels, but the relative levels that matter, right? I mean, and so what you had in times of globalization, when kind of emerging powers grow fast, then part of the geopolitical tension that comes from a shift, or a potential shift in kind of the geopolitical order as to who's the big dog, right? I mean, and those historically have been more fraught times, right? I mean, times in terms of actual war, times of Cold War, times of geopolitical tension. So I do worry, right? I do worry that we're heading for a period of just kind of world history that's going to be much choppier, right? Than what we had kind of post-Cold War, from like roughly 1990 to 2015. And I think we're headed for choppier territory. Now, the hope is that we've kind of intertwined the global supply chains and stuff so much that it's hard to completely unpack that. So you're going to start seeing some sand in the gears of globalization. And we're seeing that already. But I don't think we're going to see this extreme kind of autarky that we saw. But it's tricky. And it's going to take a lot of both global and national leadership and statesmanship to kind of navigate these choppy times coming ahead. But I think coming back to India, I think India really sees itself as kind of, a historic kind of middle power, right? I mean, that's not aligned, right? That has areas of connection everywhere in the global ecosystem, but is not seen as kind of in one block or the other, and therefore can play a bit of a role of an honest broker. So, for example, here's a very good example, right? So when people ask about Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean, and why India is kind of in the middle, and and it's very vexing, right? Because at one level, in terms of ideas, India is probably much closer to the US, but in terms of historic connections, right? I mean, it's still much closer to the erstwhile Soviet Union and Russia, right? But what role could India play in a post-war settlement? So one simple point, which just occurred to me, is that India might have nothing to do on the strategic side, but let's say you need to hold an election somewhere in the world, right? You need to get some legitimacy that a government there represents what the people want. The Indian Election Commission is probably the world's most credible organization right now that can need to go run an election in a disputed territory in a way that everybody would kind of trust those elections, right? So that's an example of how India can, by kind of its own unique strengths, right, contribute to global public goods, right? So anyway, so I hope that provides some texture, but it's a very complicated question.
Thanks, Professor. My question is, how do you think the caste system fits in, or what's its effects on growth and development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I kind of, in the time I had, I literally just had one bullet, right? When I talked about a deeply stratified society, right? And so caste is one of these complicated things that it served a historical purpose, right? And so one way to think, so if one were to be positive on this, okay, so the way to be positive on what caste did is that there are accounts of Indian history by Western historians like A.L. Basham, who's an Australian historian, right? Who's written about how historically India was a lot less violent, right? When then, when you had conflicts, you didn't have like population-wide exterminations. And that's partly because the social order was kind of settled and you just flipped the rulers, right? So it played a role in keeping order in an incredibly kind of complex, dense society, as well as creating social networks. And so there's a lot of research that says in a world when you didn't have formal institutions of credit or formal institutions of insurance, it played a lot of informal roles. But it's also clearly outlived its utility, right? It's outlived its utility in the sense that the world has changed, everything has changed, and you're still stuck in many ways, right? In a system that now is probably, almost certainly more of a barrier, right? Like to develop. Now, I think it's a very hard question to answer in an unambiguous way, because how you see the problem is so colored by your own experiences, right? And so there's people who are from historically marginalized castes for whom it is still just like race is considered the US's original sin, caste is probably India's original sin, okay, in terms of what it means for an inclusive society that gives everybody a shot at success, right? So it is something that the best long-term hope for kind of mitigating the effects are really the democratic process, right? Because again, what the founders, so the writer of the Indian Constitution was Dr. Ambedkar, who was a most distinguished member of the most marginalized caste, right? And so that was essentially the tools he was providing, right? By saying from day one, you're going to have a vote, which is something that other marginalized folks in other societies have not had. Now, of course, just like in the US, you talked about moving towards a more perfect union, that the practicality is often far from the ideals in kind of constitutions and laws. I think India is exactly like that, right? That in many ways, the laws are very progressive and have positive intention, but society has not yet fully caught up, right? With the intention of the laws.
The corruption in India, it was all this wealth, billionaires, and you have the poverty sector, and somehow the money doesn't get to the people who need it the most. And why is it? And how does that happen? And how does it get fixed?
Yeah, no, I think so. These are some of the hardest questions, right? So again, so the only thing I'll say is every period of rapid economic growth, right, in every society has been accompanied by kind of a robber baron equivalent, right? So you have that in the US, you absolutely have that in China, right? And there's an element of that in India as well, okay? So I think it's easy in the short term to kind of rail against corruption. But if you look at the long-term arc of human progress, right, it's always been the democratic process, right, that has kind of brought these excesses to heel, partly because, it's visible, right? So there's space for political entrepreneurs to come and then create those election campaigns and narratives, right? Around the idea. Now, the problem is this. The problem is it's much easier to rail against corruption than to know what is a systemic solution, right? Because, and the truth is, most corruption reflects a combination of scarcity and discretion, right? And so when you have an economics of scarcity, then there's shortages. And when you have shortages, and typically shortages of government permissions, of approvals, of things that are rationed. So all of economics teaches us that whenever you artificially restrain supply, you get a black market showing up somewhere, okay? So the long-term solution is partly kind of more democracy, but also just more state capacity, right? So the less rationed you are in providing key services, the less you need to bribe your way, right, to be able to get it. Now, when you look at the extreme fortunes, I think it's just, and this is the unfortunate truth, right, that I don't think there's any society, right, in human history that's kind of developed without going through a phase like that, okay? So hopefully it's just a passing phase, but you can see how there's a real risk that you get into Latin America type equilibrium. So you've got work by economic historians like Engerman and Sokolov who will show that when you have initial patterns of inequality, that can just get entrenched. And so the problem with inequality is not inequality per se, right? Because if everybody's getting rich, then I don't mind. We don't grudge Bill Gates' wealth because we think that came from creating so much value that everybody else is better off, right? But when that inequality reflects not the creation of productive output, but the capture of political institutions and the capture of rents, right, which is true in natural resources and different kinds of extractive sectors where your wealth depends on kind of policy and proximity to the government rather than the ability to create value, right? And that's something we just constantly have to be vigilant for. And again, the best defense for a lot of these things is with all of its imperfections, Indian democracy has more self-corrective kind of forces than you would get in most other settings. Though you may never be quite happy with where things are at a given point, you got to trust the process.
I know we have some more questions, but you also know we always end on time. So maybe you'd be willing to stay for a few minutes with some other questions. And please join us online. Look for all your little faces on the screen for a policymaker, Fed policymaker, Loretta Mester.